She stood alone on a desert ridge, black dress soaked with sweat, her baby crying against her chest, when a rider from an Apache camp locked eyes with her and rode straight toward them. No weapon drawn, no warning, just dust, hooves, and a silence so sharp it could cut. Everyone back home said they'd scalp her, but what he did instead will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The desert didn't whisper, it scraped, against skin, against memory. Abigail Monroe had stopped counting the hours since sunrise. The line between heat and exhaustion had blurred into one long fever dream of crunching gravel and chapped lips. Every breath came with the sting of dry air and the faint taste of dust. Her back ached. Her feet were blood in boots. But she didn't stop. Not with Levi in her arms. He was all she had left. 10 pounds of bone and warmth and need, bundled in what used to be a tablecloth and now passed for a swaddle. His cries came in hiccuping bursts now, half from hunger, half from the sheer injustice of being awake in a world this cruel. Abigail pressed her lips to the top of his head, even as her eyes scanned the jagged skyline ahead. Every mile was a question she couldn't answer. Every step was a gamble she had no chips to cover. She wasn't running from one man. She was running from many. From a system. A silence. A set of rules that had decided a widow was more trouble than she was worth. The bank letters had started piling up before her husband was even cold in the ground. No one wanted to hire a woman with a child strapped to her chest and dirt under her nails. The pastor called her brave to her face. She saw him give away her garden plot the next week. So she left. With no map, no horse. Just that creaky cart she'd lashed together from old orchard wood and axle parts. It squeaked and groaned behind her like a second baby. Less innocent, more burdened. When the smoke came into view, thin, gray, rising between two broken mesas, she didn't imagine salvation. But she did imagine sitting. Maybe drinking water that didn't taste like iron. Maybe just handing Levi to someone with clean hands, just for a minute. That wasn't hope. It was survival. But then she saw them. The riders weren't like the ones in dime store stories. No war cries. No rifles aimed from afar. Just men with ribbons in their braids, beads that caught the sun, and horses that moved like they were part of the wind itself. One of them stood, hands on his hips, scanning the ridge like he'd felt her eyes before he saw her face. She held Levi tighter. And then he moved, a single rider breaking from the circle, heading straight for her. No hesitation, no drawn weapon, just momentum and inevitability. She didn't lift her skirt to run, didn't scream. There was no one left to hear her. She just whispered into Levi's curls, voice hoarse and low. Whatever happens now, at least someone saw us. And then she stood her ground, not out of courage, but because the road had ended, and whatever came next had to be better than the nothing behind her. Narrative. Tone. Intimate, reverent, and emotionally grounded. A tone of quiet discovery and fragile peace. The man didn't speak with words. He didn't need to. His presence said enough. The moment his boots touched the dirt, Abigail felt something inside her unclench. Not all the way, not enough to call it trust, but enough to keep her from backing up. Enough to still her trembling fingers on Levi's blanket. The horse stood patient behind him, unmoving except for the twitch of a tail. Dust clung to its legs like shadow. The rider himself, his skin the color of baked earth, his braids thick and tied with red and turquoise leather, watched her the way you watch a wounded animal. Careful not to spook, not out of fear, but respect. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 35. But life had carved lines in his face that suggested a story twice as long. His expression never shifted from calm, but his gaze was alert, present. not the glazed disinterest of passers-by who pitied her, or the cold appraisal of county men tallying her worth in debts and land parcels. This was different. When he finally moved, it was with the slow certainty of someone used to being understood without raising their voice. He extended an arm. Not toward her, toward the camp. A gesture, a pause. One word, spoken low and unfamiliar, then a slight tilt of his head. Invitation, not demand. It wasn't how people usually treated her anymore. And so, silently, she followed. Down the ridge, over packed dirt and into the heart of the camp. What she expected was resistance, suspicion, maybe even ridicule. What she received instead was space. Not the empty kind she'd walked through for days, but the kind made intentionally. Room for her to breathe, to arrive, to exist without explanation. They didn't crowd her, but they noticed her, and that alone felt like water on parched ground. A woman with silver in her braid and the quiet authority of a matriarch stepped forward. She didn't speak, just gently reached for Levi, her movements slow, open, undeniable. Abigail's arms resisted, just for a second, then relented. The woman's hands, warm and work-worn, cradled him with such natural grace that something inside Abigail trembled and cracked. She hadn't felt that kind of touch since the night her husband died. A bowl was passed into her hands, stew thick with root vegetables, wild herbs, and kindness. A ladle of water was placed beside her on the ground, and then someone guided her to a low tent, stitched hide and sturdy bones, smoke-laced and quiet. Inside, she sat cross-legged, her body stiff, unsure if this was a dream that would vanish the moment her eyes drifted. But Levi was beside her, breathing slow, finally sleeping, and above them, shadows flickered, orange and gold, dancing like the echoes of prayers she hadn't dared whisper. Abigail didn't weep at first, but as the fire crackled and the night held its breath, the tears came. Slow, salt-heavy, silent. She cried not because she was afraid. She cried because, for the first time in so long, it felt like she wasn't alone. Narrative tone. Warm, quietly redemptive, and deeply human. A tone of healing through repetition, respect, and silent connection. Abigail didn't ask Elin why he helped her. She never had to. Each morning he was there before the sun turned the dirt gold. Quiet steps, the swish of a water pail, the firm thud of chopped wood laid beside her tent like a promise. He didn't linger. He never sought thanks. But his presence filled the space like a shadow that meant safety instead of threat. The others in the camp didn't coddle her. They didn't probe her past or fawn over her child. But neither did they keep her at arm's length. Their eyes held neither suspicion nor sympathy, only expectation, the subtle kind that said, "You're here now, so live." And Abigail understood. Pity had a scent. She'd worn it for months, clinging to her like dust that never washed clean. But here, it burned off in the fire smoke, in the sweat behind her neck, in the rhythm of her hands moving with purpose. She started by asking, for anything. Could she stir the stew? Clean the hides? Boil willow bark for fever tea? The answer wasn't yes, not at first. It was silence, a glance, a pause. And then, one morning, as she watched the women mend a ceremonial shawl beside the fire, an older woman with hands like bark passed her a needle. No instruction, no nod, just sat beside her and began to sew. The cloth was thick, awkward in her hands. Abigail pricked herself 3 times before she found the rhythm. The thread pulled tight. The seam held. No one commented. But the next morning, a small stack of worn clothes waited beside her tent. It was an invitation. It was a test. It was hers. Abigail's shoulders stopped tensing every time someone walked behind her. Her back began to ache not from grief, but from labor. She learned to cut sinew without fraying it, to braid onions for winter storage, to wrap Levi in wool that didn't itch. His laughter came more often now, high-pitched bursts that caught in the wind like song. Sometimes at night she would catch herself humming, and across the fire Elin would be sitting, always a bit closer than the night before, always silent, but listening. She didn't know what to call what was happening between them. It wasn't courtship, not yet. It wasn't romance. It was recognition. A slow, quiet knowing that some people grow close not with words, but with work. Narrative tone, deeply reflective and tender. A tone of earned peace and lasting emotional restoration. This is the quiet heartbeat after the storm, the kind of closure that doesn't require fanfare, only presence. The winters in the high desert weren't cruel, just honest. They came without apology, stripping the leaves, thinning the air, making every ember in the fire feel sacred. But Abigail didn't fear the cold anymore. She wore it like a cloak, stitched together with memory and new beginnings. The girl who once wandered barefoot and blistered across the Badlands, clutching a baby and a folded death certificate, had vanished quietly, like mist rising off morning rock. In her place stood a woman who no longer walked like she expected the earth to break beneath her. Abigail had learned their words, first from Levi's lips, then from the mouths of women by the river, from the songs sung low during planting, and the jokes whispered between hunters over shared meals. Her tongue still stumbled on the syllables sometimes, but no one laughed. They corrected her with patience, the way one smooths a woven pattern without pulling it apart. She wore cotton now, dyed deep with berry and earth. Her hair, once pinned tight in grief, flowed freely down her back, streaked with wind and resilience. Her skin held a new color, kissed by the sun and the smoke of 100 evening fires. And then came that night. No crowd, no ceremony, just Ellen, quiet as ever, with a gift wrapped in leather string. A bracelet, carved with his hands, inlaid with turquoise and ashwood. The design wasn't elaborate, but the meaning was. "You belong here," he said, voice low, eyes steady. "If you want to." She didn't need to speak. She simply reached out and took his hand, pressing her fingers into his calloused palm like sealing a pact older than language. It wasn't the kind of vow the preacher back home would have recognized. There were no rings, no paper, no "I do." But there was something deeper, something rooted, not ceremony, sanctuary. And when years passed and strangers rode through the territory and asked about the white woman with the dark-haired son who danced like he was born to the wind, they were never told of the journey. Not the grave, not the dust, not the hunger. They were told this: she gave more than she took. She stayed when she could have run. She grew where she could have withered. And under that wide, forgiving sky, beneath stars that blinked like memory, Abigail finally rested, not as a visitor, but as part of the land, part of the story, part of the home she never dared to dream.